December 7th, 1941 is still, it's very vivid because I was cleaning a car seat on our front porch and a neighbor came down the street screaming and yelling. He says, "The Japs are coming, the Japs are coming. They bombed Pearl Harbor, they're going to the Philippines," and our hair stood on end. A war. The war was in Europe, but all of a sudden there's a war and we're in it and we don't know what's going to happen next. And within a day or so, everything completely changed, restrictions on everything. And I remember December 8th, I was a student at the Burbank Military Academy, and all the students were put in a room, and we listened to President Roosevelt. That speech you can't forget. Shortly thereafter, being next to Lockheed, airplanes. And yes, it was war, but wow, it was exciting in a way, even though we weren't being attacked here.
Speaking of attacks, I know post-Pearl Harbor, immediately post-Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of hysteria, if you will. And there was an event called the Battle of Los Angeles, when some of the anti-aircraft guns, and I don't know if it was near you, but I know it was down further south towards San Pedro, some of the anti-aircraft guns opened fire on something that was over LA. It turned out, of course, to be nothing, but the hysteria was such at the time that they thought that it could have been Japanese aircraft. Do you recall that? It was kind of a big deal back then. Do you recall that happening?
Some months after we got used to the fact that, yes, we're in a war, this is a very involved thing, and yes, we're safe because the Japanese and the Germans will probably never come to Los Angeles. But one night, I woke up and they had searchlights everywhere, these great big floodlights. And every time they turned those on, it kind of gave you the willies like, oh, I wonder what's happening. Well, on that night, besides seeing the searchlights going around, I kept hearing these muffled booms. They weren't very loud because they were quite a few miles away, but you could see little popping fireworks in the sky. And I didn't sleep well that night. I thought, oh my gosh, there is a war. I wonder who that is. But there was no planes that I could see or hear. And then, of course, the next morning, it was quite obvious on the radio that there was a large squadron of airplanes in the sky, and everybody said they saw them. And all the anti-aircraft guns that had been put everywhere in LA, they just were shooting. And I thought the funny part was most of these shells didn't blow up in the sky. They came down and they hit people's cars and they hit yards and damaged a few things. And I think within a couple of days, it was like everybody laughed and says, well, what was that? But it left us really frightened. And it wasn't too long after that there was a submarine showed up off Santa Barbara, and there was an oil tank, and this little tiny sub came up and popped the tank a couple of times. It was no big deal. I think it must have been a lark on the part of a couple of Japanese guys, but that really scared the daylights now, because now we were really, really frightened. And of course, at about that time, I had Japanese friends, students, and one day the kid came by and he said, goodbye, I have to go now. And then I went over to his house, and there was a big army truck there, a big stake truck. And the Army simply pulled up, told the family to get in the truck and bring some personal goods. And he waved goodbye, and away they went. And then the Army came later, and they confiscated the house, took everything out of it, and that was that. So somehow we were scared to death of any Japanese that were here. They're born here, you know. These are Japanese Americans. You know, we're all friends. They're all gardeners and we're in the flower business. Well, they didn't do anything wrong, but it seemed incredible that, my gosh, this war is now very, very serious. It's taking away our friends.
How did that, I mean, you were 10, 11 years old at that time. How did that affect you when you're losing your buddies, you know, and some of them are going away? Obviously, you had no clue where they were going. They had no clue where they were going. Did that strike you odd as a young boy, or did you just kind of go with the flow? You know?
Well, all these different kinds of events, such as you know, the so-called air raid that wasn't, the little submarine that's popping an oil tank, and then it got closer to home as your Japanese friends and families are being taken away. It was illustrating the seriousness of this war that was really, really beginning to affect us. And I think even though, to me, personally, watching the war was a lot of fun, but there was this sort of background nervous terror that, gee, I wonder if the war will ever come here, you know, seriously come here. So we were seeing evidence. Every month went by, there was more and more evidence of the seriousness of this. I don't recall what happened to Germans. I didn't know that many Germans, but we had a lot of Japanese friends here, you know, being Southern California. Over time, I think the fact that I think the rationing was probably the hardest part, because you had to kind of shift gears into working around the food you can't buy anymore. And everybody started building victory gardens. Anybody who had a backyard big enough, and we had a half acre, we had fruit trees. So by that time, my dad and my mother said, well, get started. Besides the chickens and the ducks and everything I had to manage, I learned how to use every square foot in the yard and put in this what we call victory garden, and we just started, anything you could grow, you'd start growing it. So pretty soon, in the sort of the middle years of the war, it was very common. A lot of people, their food, more of it came from their yard than came from a grocery store. I also raised goats, and I sold goat's milk. So I had set up quite a business besides my paper routes. I had the goats. We had free milk, quite obviously. We had the chickens, so we had eggs. We had every kind of vegetable you want. We had the trees. We had all the fruit. So in a way, the war changed the whole economic life that you had. But it seemed to be, I always thought, kind of fun. It was kind of exciting because it was something different. And it's kind of a juxtaposition with, let's say I'm looking at the Hollywood Citizen News every day, the paper that I work for, and I'm following this dreadful war with the maps. I was quite taken with the graphic maps every day that showed somebody's advancing, somebody's not, which place got blown up, you know, on and on and on. So it was fascinating to follow, even though it was thousands of miles away, but the war that we were living in was, you know, there weren't bombs there. I mean, nobody's getting killed, nobody's getting hurt, but the details of your daily life are totally different. I can only suggest that we got so used to it that in a way it wasn't a bother, but everybody contributed. Like, let's say, anybody who had aluminum in their house, pots and pans, well, we would have drives going out. We'd knock on everybody's door and say, give us all your aluminum pots and pans. And we had these great big drives to see which kids could bring home the most pots and take them down to the schoolyard, so the military would come and take these truckloads of aluminum to make airplanes out of. You know, little stuff like that. Sure, it's a sacrifice, give away your best pots, you know, but it's war, you just did it.